So, short summary. Author's landlord tried to increase the rent by 25%. They had no choice but to negotiate a middleman representing the landlord. Negotiation failed, and the tenant had to move out of their home. Tenants lack leverage in negotiating their rent. Landlords have more power in the tenant-landlord relationship. The reason for high rents are not what landlords claim. Two bills in New York aim to make the tenant-landlord relationship more equal and could serve as models for the rest of the country. Anonymity in LLCs makes it difficult for tenants to know who their landlord is and hold them accountable. Nearly 1 in 6 rental properties are owned by LLCs, which makes housing more expensive and worse.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things they said was when they were explaining how LLCs work, they said that people who form LLCs for their businesses have limited liability for what their business does. That means they're not accountable for when the business screws people over. And that's not entirely true, is it? Maybe it's harder to go after them, but like, it doesn't mean you can break the law freely, right?
Breaking the law is one thing. That's a different thing.
The guy was given an illegal rent increase and then couldn't find out who his landlord was and then was evicted. And in my mind, I'm like, well, surely that could be taken to court. Like, an LLC doesn't mean like you're not responsible for anything. If he's
what makes a rent increase illegal?
There wasn't enough notice given. So basically what happened was he got a notice saying your rent's going up by this amount effective next month. And in New York, you need to give 90-day notice or 6 month or something like that. So he responded and said, hey, you can't change the rent with that little notice. And is there room for negotiation? And then they replied with an eviction letter.
Well, I mean, in that case, he would just have to file a complaint with the housing authority. The housing authority would send notice to the LLC. They would serve them papers. It's not that big of a deal. Like, I think people get too wrapped up in this, but the LLC would be held accountable.
At the eviction notice, they just left.
That was their choice also to not fight it, right? Because technically the landlord is the LLC. The owner of the LLC is not the landlord. He's the owner of the LLC. The LLC is the landlord.
Right.
Now, if something breaking the law happened, like, for example, giving too short of a notice on a rent increase, that's not a law, that's a regulation, and that's not the same thing. Doing 70 miles an hour in a school zone is breaking the law, but giving too short of a notice is violating a regulation, a city ordinance or a regulation. That's not the same thing as a law. So he didn't break a law. He might have violated an existing regulation, and then the tenant would have to push back on that with the housing authority and say, hey, I wasn't given sufficient notice. And I'm not saying the landlord did the right thing necessarily, but like as a person, even if you own that house yourself in your own name, it's not like the police are going to come arrest you for sending them too short of a notice. Like they're not going to do anything. And whether he owned it himself or whether he owned it through an LLC actually made no difference in this case, because they basically contacted their landlord just like they always would, whether it's a human or it's XYZ LLC, and say, hey, how about we negotiate this? And they send them an eviction notice. A human can do the same thing. A human can send an eviction notice too.
I guess their argument was that the anonymity gives them like a safety blanket and feeling more comfortable with screwing the tenants.
Yeah, my only point is it doesn't matter whether you do it as a natural person or a legal person. It's the same thing. You can do it as a natural person also or a legal person. It makes no difference. And yeah, maybe he felt a little more comfortable sending them an eviction notice because his human name was not on it. What else were you going to do? Like you say, no human, I really want to negotiate this, or no LLC, I really want to negotiate this. Like the result is still the same. It makes no difference.
Yeah. So they didn't need to just bend over for it. And
yeah, but they chose to just move out. I mean, they could have pushed hard. Also, an eviction notice doesn't happen so quickly. They might have gotten a letter stating they were being evicted, but in New York, you can't be evicted within 30 days. It's not even possible. Like he might have just like on his own wrote them a letter saying you're being evicted. You need to get out within whatever, 15 days, 30 days, whatever it is. Just because he uses the word evicted doesn't mean anything. But a true eviction is like when the sheriff comes and knocks on your door and says, hey, get out. They send you a notice and they tell you to leave. And if you don't, then they do come knock on your door and hold your hand out the door. And if you fight back, they hold your hand in handcuffs out the door.
Bye.